Hi, it's Steve. Today we'd like to show you how to change the spider assembly on your front load washer. Although it's a rather lengthy job, it's an easy job. So let me show you how we do it. Now to do this repair, we will need to basically disassemble the complete washer. So first of all, you're going to need to unplug it, disconnect the inlet fill supplies and the drain hose, and you'll want to pull the washer out to an area where we can remove both the top, the front, and then we'll be able to access the inside of the cabinet. So once we've got all of our supplies disconnected, next we're going to remove a couple of screws that secure that back panel in place. Then just lift up on it slightly to disengage two little tabs on the bottom. Slide it down and away, and then we'll set that aside. Next we'll remove two screws that secure the top to the cabinet. Then just grasp both sides of the top, pull it slightly back towards you, lift it off, and then we'll set that aside. Now we'll turn the washer around, we'll go to the front of it again. And the next step will be to remove the console and the front panel assembly so that we can access the front of the tub. Now to remove the console, we'll begin by pulling the detergent drawer out. Just depress that release tab and remove the drawer. Then we'll locate one screw over in the left corner here. And then there will be 3 or 4 screws across the top. And these will go through plastic tabs that are part of that console. Once you remove those screws, we should be able to lift up slightly on that control panel at the back to release those plastic tabs. Lift it up enough to release the tabs across the bottom on the front. And then we can pivot that out of the way for now. Now next we'll open the door up and we'll need to remove the spring clamp that goes around that door bellows. On this style of washer, you can simply grasp that bellows, just pull it free. The spring and clamp will pop off. Then you can just pull the bellows away from that front panel and then tuck it in behind it. And next we'll remove the screws that secure this door lock assembly to the front panel. There'll be 2 right around the latch area and then another one up by the switch. Then there will be some screws across the top of that front panel that secure it to the cabinet. So we'll need to remove those. Make sure we support that front panel and door assembly as you remove the last screw. There's a little spring clip in the center. You may need to depress that just slightly to push that front panel forward. So you may need to use a flat blade screwdriver to depress that spring tab. And once we've cleared that, we can then lift that front panel up and pull it away from the cabinet. Just make sure we tilt that out far enough, then lift it off of the 3 tabs across the bottom of the cabinet. We'll set this assembly aside. Now, although you can do this repair with the control panel still connected to the wire harnesses, it is much easier if you remove it altogether and less chance for any damage to occur. So begin by removing this 2-wire harness that has a short lead on it. So depress the locking tab, pull that harness away. Then we can access 2 more in that same area. Again, there are locking tabs for them, so make sure that we depress the locking tabs and then pull up on the connectors. And we'll need to remove these 2 that are close to the center. And again, make sure we depress the little locking tabs. and then 3 more close to the top of that control panel. Now this harness is tucked in behind some little plastic tabs to keep it in place. So you'll need to manipulate that around those. Once we've removed those, we can set that console aside. Now with the front panel removed, we'll next concentrate on removing both the air dome tube assembly and the temp sensor harness. The temp sensor harness connector has a release tab that we need to depress. And you can pull that off. We'll also disconnect the clamp on that air dome tube. Just using a pair of pliers, we're simply going to depress that clamp, slide it, so we'll depress that clamp, and then we'll just pull it up onto the air dome tube. You can twist the tube to break the bond, and then pull it off of that front tub cover. Now next we'll need to remove the counterweights that are attached to the front portion of that outer tub. So using a 13mm socket, we'll loosen those. And then carefully lift that weight away from the front of the tub and set it aside. We'll use the same procedure on the left side of the tub. And again, just lift that one off and set it aside. Now with the counterweights removed, our next step will be to remove bolts for the shocks, and we'll typically take them off right at the tub. With the bolt removed, you can just depress that shock or stabilizer and then just tuck it out of the way. Repeat the procedure for the opposite side. And tuck that shock out of the way. I'll also suggest that you disconnect these little straps that secure that air dome tube to the side of the tub. It may be a zip tie, or they may be in the form of a wire tie. You just disconnect those, and that will allow us to pull that air dome tube away from the tub. Also be a foam pad for sound dampening that may be attached to that. Now our next step will be to disconnect the inlet hose from the detergent drawer to the tub front. There's usually a large clamp right up the very top. We'll simply depress that and we'll pull that hose right off of the detergent drawer. Just squeeze the clamp together and pull it down off of the outlet, and then release that hose. Now next we're going to remove the bolts that secure the front portion of that outer tub to the back portion. There's a series of 10mm bolts that go all the way around the perimeter of that tub. And now we can move to the top of the tub and remove the remaining bolts. So next we'll remove the 4 bolts across the top of the tub. Now our next step will be to lift up on one of these suspension springs, either left or right, and disengage it from the little hook at the very top to begin with. Then we'll detach it from the 2 halves of the tub, separate the front of the tub from the rear of the tub on that side, and then reconnect the spring to the back portion of the tub. Now to give you a better visual of removing that spring on this side, I'm going to remove this little frame with the balance or suspension absorption weight and springs. I'll remove that so that we can see a little better. It's not necessary to do this for the actual repair. Basically what we'll do is we'll lift the hook of the spring out of this little nylon holder, lift it out, support the tub while we rotate the bottom hook out of the slot that fits through both the front and rear halves of the tub. So either support the tub by yourself or have somebody help you. So while supporting that tub, we're just going to tilt that suspension spring down, slide it out through those 2 holes, and then carefully separate the tub on this side enough that we can reconnect the spring just on the back portion. And now we can lift that whole tub assembly back up and connect the top hook on that hinge into the socket at the top of the cabinet. So we're just going to repeat that procedure for the opposite side of the tub. Again, we'll just lift up on that spring to disengage the hook at the top. Lower that tub down. It should rest on the motor. Then we can tilt that spring to release the front portion of the tub. So while supporting that tub, we're just going to tilt that suspension spring down, slide it out through those 2 holes, and then carefully separate the tub on this side enough that we can reconnect the spring. Now that we have the front half of that tub released, we'll just grasp it and we'll pull it out through the front of the washer. And we'll also inspect around this edge to make sure that there's no serious damage to that tub cover that may create a leak due to a broken tub support or spider assembly. And if that's damaged, you'll need to replace that as well. Now next we'll turn the washer around, or we'll go to the back fit where we can remove the drive pulley and belt and the nut that secures that inner tub and spider assembly to the bearing housing. Then we'll pull that whole tub right out. So just grasp that belt on either side, rotate it around that large pulley while pulling it towards the back to release it. We'll set that aside. Next, we'll need to remove that nut, which is a 19mm or a 3/4 inch socket will work as well. So we'll give that a little sharp tug to get it started. So we'll remove the nut, lock washer, and the spacer washer, and retain those. And just wiggle that pulley off and set that aside. Now next we'll need to drive that shaft through those bearings out through the front. Now because this is part of the assembly that we're replacing, we don't need to worry about damaging those threads. We'll give that a fairly hard wrap with a large hammer. That's broke it free from the bearing, so we can go to the front again, and we'll pull that tub completely out. So now just grasp that inner basket and pull that whole assembly out through the front. And then we'll set it face down where we can remove the 6 bolts that secure that spider assembly to the tub. First, we'll inspect around the edge of that tub, make sure there's no damage to that inner basket or inner tub, and if so, you would need to replace it. We'll also want to inspect the seal assembly at the back of the tub, and if it appears like it has been leaking water into there, you'll need to replace that and the bearings as well. In this particular washer, both the seal and the bearings are in good shape. It's just the spider assembly that is damaged. Now, when disassembling the inner basket from the spider assembly, we need to remove those 6 bolts. And typically those are in there fairly tight, and they do have a thread locking material on them to hold them in place. So often they don't want to come out easily. So we suggest that you purchase 6 new bolts when you purchase the spider assembly, and then you don't need to worry about breaking any. Now, you can also apply a little bit of heat to this spider assembly, and that should aid in taking those bolts out. So using a 10mm socket with a ratchet, we'll go ahead and remove those. We suggest that you use caution when removing these bolts due to the shape of these holes. They're punched through that stainless steel from the inside, so there will be some sharp edges here. You want to make sure that you wear some protective gloves so that you don't injure yourself removing those bolts should they slip or break. And just continue to remove all 6 bolts in that manner. Now, with all the bolts removed, we can remove the broken spider or trunnion assembly and discard it. Now, when installing the spider assembly to the inner basket, we'll note that the bolts that secure that were countersunk, and they've pushed the little dimples into the outer edge of that inner tub. So we're going to need to just tap those back a bit with a small ball peen hammer, otherwise this will not fit in easily. So just take a few moments and knock those out a little bit. So it should lie flush. These little tabs on each of the spokes of that spider assembly should lay flush on the rim of that inner basket. Now that we have it all centered up, we'll start by just lining up those bolts. And if you've chosen to buy bolts locally, make sure that you put some thread locker on them, and keep in mind that they are a metric thread. So we'll make sure all 6 bolts are started first. And then using a ratchet or a wrench, we'll tighten them all securely. Make sure they're nice and snug, but don't over tighten them, as we are using a hard stainless steel bolt into an alloy type material, so you may break them off if you're not careful. Now next we'll need to prepare that outer tub, clean any debris that may be in that area, in the sump area. Get that all out of there. Again, we'll inspect that seal and bearing assembly, make sure they're fine. Also the gasket that goes between the rear outer tub and the front outer tub, make sure that's in good shape, or replace it if necessary. Now before we put the inner basket back into the outer tub, we'll make sure that the area where the bearing is going to sit, the 2 areas, are clean and free of any debris. Now it's not necessary to lubricate those, because actually we'll want to make sure that these don't turn in the bearing, but that the bearing actually attaches itself to those. If you wish, you can coat this portion in the middle with a light coating of grease. And we're simply going to line it up, carefully slide it into that outer tub, and then we can secure it with the bolt and washers. Once we have it securely in place, we'll put the flat washers and the nut back on the stud at the rear of that spider assembly. Now ready to slide that basket into place. So just rest it on the lip at the bottom of that rear outer tub, and then while viewing it down through the top, you can help center it up into that seal assembly. And carefully slide it back until you engage both bearings. Should turn freely, but not have any play in it. Now we'll go to the back and secure it. So just verify that that spider assembly came all the way through. You should see the shoulder of that just about flush with the inner race of that rear bearing. Next we'll take the pulley, slide that over that shaft. Take the flat washer, we're just going to flip that over because it would have been slightly concave not being on there previously. Our lock washer, and then the retaining nut. And slowly rotate the large pulley. You'll need to pinch that belt to the large pulley with your thumb, and then just rotate it until it's completely on. And then we'll need to make sure that we center that belt onto the large pulley. You'll note that there are more grooves in the motor pulley than there are grooves on the belt, and we can easily rotate it and shift that belt either in or out on that motor pulley to make sure that it lines up properly on the driven pulley. Now, if you have access to a torque wrench, the recommended setting would be somewhere around 50 foot-pounds of torque on that spindle nut. So simply take either a large screwdriver or an extension for your ratchet, and put it in between the spokes of the pulley and one of the cutouts in the back of that tub. And once it's tightened up securely, you can either replace the belt if you haven't put it on yet, and if you have put the belt on, we'll just put the access panel on the back now. So to install that back panel, we'll take the long tabs, slide them in at the top, tilt the panel into position, and then engage the bottom tabs, pull down until the screw holes line up, and install the retaining screws. And now we'll go to the front of the washer where we can reinstall the front outer tub. Now when installing that front outer tub, we want to line up these tabs around that tub. First of all, you need to rotate it slightly to get it through the opening on the front. Then just line up that tab in the top center first. Get as close as you can to begin with. And what we're going to do is lift up on that suspension spring, lift the whole tub up so that we can push the two halves together and slide that spring back through those two openings. Now you may need some assistance to do that. Again, we'll need to lift up on that tub, disengage the spring from the top, lower it down, rotate that spring to remove it from the holes, and we'll line up that tub. As long as we have the hole where the spring goes through lined up, we can go ahead and push that spring back through it. Then lift the whole assembly up and hook that suspension spring in at the top. Now we'll repeat that procedure on the opposite side. Pull the two halves of the tub together, hook that spring back through the openings, and lift the assembly up, making sure that the top hook on that spring fits into that plastic insert. Now next we'll put a couple of those screws in on the top just to hold it in place, and then we'll make sure that we have the bottom lined up, and we'll install some of the screws there as well. Now before we tighten those screws, we want to make sure that that tub is lined up so that we don't force it using the screw. And now we'll put some in on the bottom. Now again, first verify that all of these holes line up and the lip on that, on the both halves of that outer tub are flush. And if they aren't, you may need to release the spring on the side, one side or the other, enough that we can position that tub properly. Only when we have it straight, we can install those retaining bolts. And then just continue to install all of those. And just continue around both sides of the tub till we have them all in. Now, once we have all of the bolts that secure the two halves of the tub together, we can go ahead and put our counterweights on and our air dome tube and temp sensor. So next we'll reattach the shocks to the outer tubs. So just extend them enough that they'll line up at the hole through the mount at the front. You should also use some thread locker on these bolts that secure that top of that shock to the tub. Just a couple of drops. There's lots. Do the same thing for the other side. Now, once we have those secure, we can go ahead and install the harness for the temp sensor. Make sure the locking tab engages. And then install the retaining screw on that retaining clamp. Next, we'll position that air dome tube onto the nipple on that outer tub. Make sure it's pressed firmly on. Using our pliers, we'll slide that clamp down into position. And then put the screw through that retaining clamp on the front. You can route that hose through the wire ties. And just make sure that we don't have those too tight that we pinch off that hose. We just need to make sure that it's protected so it doesn't get pinched. Now next we'll reinstall the counterweights on the side. is hang them in place first. Take the retaining bolts, and again, we'll add a little bit of thread locker to those. And then tighten them securely. Do the same for the opposite side. And again, tighten them securely. Next, we'll reposition that hose from the detergent box. And you'll note that there is a notch in the top of that hose that lines up with a little tab on that detergent box. Make sure it's pressed firmly up against it. Position the clamp. And now we're ready to reinstall the front panel. You can just temporarily set that door lock assembly in that opening. Now when reinstalling the front panel assembly, we want to make sure that we line up those 3 slots in the bottom of that panel with the 3 hooks that are part of the base of the washer. So tilt the panel back, line those up, make sure it's sitting flush on all 3 of them. Now when we tilt that panel up, just make sure that that door lock assembly is safely inside the tub. And press that front panel door assembly up against the cabinet till that little hook on the top engages. That should hold it in place until we install the screws across the top. Now next, we can open up that door, and then we'll position that door lock assembly into the front panel. So we'll take that door lock assembly, and just push that door boot out of the way. We're going to tuck that in behind, lining up the latch portion and the switch portion in the appropriate holes. And while holding it in place, we'll install the screws. Well, next, we'll pull the door bellows out through that opening. And we want to make sure that we tuck the V-shaped portion of that bellows down into the groove of that front panel. Now just make sure it's flush all the way around. And we'll take that band clamp or spring clamp, position it so that the spring is roughly in the 6 o'clock position. We'll tuck the wire down into that groove. Now while stretching the spring by pulling on that wire, you can fit it in the rest of the way around. sure it's firmly locked in place. We can close that door up. Now next we'll reinstall the control panel. Now before we reinstall the harnesses to that control panel, I want to point out where these tabs are across the bottom. And there are 7 of them that will fit into appropriate slots across the top of that front panel. When we go to tilt that in, we need to make sure that those are all engaged. So we'll proceed with reconnecting the harness. As you press each one into place, make sure that the locking tabs engage. And the last one that we'll put in is the reddish colored one with the 2 gray wires. Make sure it's engaged. And now we'll line up those tabs on the bottom. And as we pivot that back into place, make sure that there are no kinks in that wire harness. And it should lay nice and flush. Then we'll reinstall the 3 screws that we moved across the back of that console, as well as the one in the front by the soap box. And make sure that we reuse the proper screw for the hole by that soap box. It's a stainless steel screw and it's slightly longer than the 3 that we removed across the top. And then we can put the detergent drawer back in. The tab engages properly. Now if you remove the vibration mechanism when installing the 2 outer tubs together, or removing those 2 outer tubs together, we'll need to reconnect that. And as well, we've noted often when you're pulling that spring around, you may disengage the overflow or suds hose at the back. So we'll need to make sure that that's in place. There's an arrow on the top of it. We need to make sure that that's lined up properly. It'll sit pretty much flush with the back panel. Just compress the clamp with your hand and pop that into place. We'll set that vibration piece, lining up the 3 tabs with the slots across that center support. Drop it down into place, and then we can reinstall the retaining screws. And now we're ready to reinstall the main top. Now to do that, we want to make sure that we line up these little keyhole slots at the front of that main top with these 2 shoulder screws that are set back about 2 inches from the back edge of that console. So lay the panel in place, make sure the front edges are down flush, slide it forward, and that should engage those 2 keyhole slots. We can then rotate it around and we'll install the 2 retaining screws at the back. Now we're ready to push that washer back into position. We're now ready to reconnect our supplies, plug the washer back in, and our repair is complete.